So, what can governments do to reduce instabilities? One of the things that's been tried over the years has been what are called buffer stock schemes. So, these are generally implemented by the government, although sometimes groups of producers will club together to try and run one of these. And the idea is that the reason that prices go up really high is if there's a shortage on the market, if there's too much demand. The reason that prices might drop very suddenly, drop a long way, is if there's too much supply. So what government says, well, surely we could balance these out. What we could do is, in a year when far too much has been produced, we could buy it and store it. Then, in a subsequent year, if there was too much demand, in other words, not enough was being produced, then we could release our supplies from storage and stop the price from going up. So the US has a strategic oil reserve, for example, that it can use. I mean, mainly it's for kind of military purposes, but in principle, that they can buy and sell this oil to help to try to stabilise global prices. So how would that work? So what normally, the way these have tended to work in the past, is that there's normally been a floor price. So what we don't want is for the price to fall below the floor. We don't want it in this area here. And then there's a ceiling. So the government doesn't want to be intervening all the time. So we don't want price to rise above the ceiling, and we don't want price to fall below the floor. So this is our ideal zone for prices. So what would happen? So let's suppose that there's demand and there's supply. At the moment, price is in this comfort zone. It's in this ideal zone, so there's no particular problem. Suppose that there was a sudden increase in supply. So the weather was particularly good, and supply rises dramatically. So supply rises to S2. So what's going to start to happen? At the original price, this supply is no longer here. So at this original price here, there's now much more supply than demand. So what's going to start happening is that price is going to start falling, and then we're going to hit the floor. And at the floor, we can see that we have a problem because price is going to continue to fall unless somebody does something, because supply is at level S1, demand is only at level D1, so there's far more supply than demand at our floor price. Supply is, say, 500 million, demand is, say, 400 million, so therefore the government has to buy up 100 million tonnes. So what it does is the government essentially demands that, so it buys AB units of this stuff. So sudden increase in supply, the government buys the excess supply at the floor price. So if they've said we don't want it to fall below $10 a ton, or $10 a kilo, whatever, then the government will buy 100 million units at $10 each, and we'll come back to this in a bit more detail later. So they then store that, and they wait for another year. So let's suppose that next year or the year after, supply falls all the way to S3. So now what's going to happen is that prices are going to start to rise. They're going to rise and rise and rise. They're driven up until we reach the ceiling. At the ceiling, prices would continue to rise. I mean, the government can't simply say prices can't go up. The government doesn't set the price. They're set by markets. So at the ceiling, the problem is that there's still demand here of, say, 250 million units, but supply is only 150 million units. So what would now happen, in principle, is the government would say, well, okay, I've got 100 million units that I bought before in storage. I can now sell them at this ceiling price, which is, say, $15. So what the government does is it increases supply to match demand. It sells CD units to stop prices from rising. And that's the essence of buffer stock schemes. And in theory, it's clever because it should finance itself. We buy at a low price and we sell at a high price. In the real world, these things tend to go horribly wrong. you can't store things forever. It's very expensive to store them. And in reality, technology and incentives for producers have tended to mean that instead of supply varying between S2 and S3, as time's gone by, then what's tended to happen is that new technology, better seeds, and so on, mean that we end up with supply over here all the time. What that means is the government always ends up buying, which means it then runs out of money. And that's one of the classic problems with buffer stock schemes. So buffer stock schemes aren't used very often these days, but elements of them sometimes are. Sometimes governments will impose a maximum price in certain markets, and sometimes they'll try and guarantee a floor price. And we'll look at each of those two in turn next.